Hello, my name is Depp Kielmeyer and I'm a board certified psychiatrist. I'm back for an update on the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard case. If you haven't listened watched my first video and you are not up to date on the case, I would suggest doing that first. Also, I go in depth on personality disorders in general in that video, if that's something that you're looking for. So if you like this video, please subscribe. And also, I just want to make everyone aware that I continue to use the Instagram page, the JD case, to keep up with things, as well as watching Law and Crime Network's live video feed of the trial. And disclaimer, I am not diagnosing, I am merely giving a psychiatrist's perspective of the evidence. Okay, so now let's get to the new information that we have since the last video I made, which was this past weekend. So we have a whole new week of trial that occurred. So we saw even more testimony of people witnessing abusive behavior from Amber and not Johnny, or people who just didn't really witness anything at all. Something else that sort of got confirmed that I had brought up in my last video is that I had brought up that Amber never really donated the $7 million divorce settlement to charity like she had said she did, and like all the news outlets had given her positive attention for, that she arranged, by the way. So this was confirmed because ACLU took the stand and they stated that they received $100K from Johnny in Amber's name, and then $500K from Elon Musk. And part of this, essentially the instructions for that $500K was that it needed to be on the behalf of Amber and no one was supposed to know it came from him. And then they did say that they received $350K from Amber, but allegedly this is actually from Elon Musk as well. So why this is important is, the $700 million divorce settlement, she said she gave half to Children's Hospital and half to ACLU. But now we know that was not given. So, and she did tons of interviews about how she donated this money, etc., etc. And then ACLU, while on the stand, also noted that they assisted Amber with the op-ed that started this all, where she stated that she was a victim of domestic violence and that, we all knew it was about Johnny, and that's how this all started, really. So on top of that, they decided that the op-ed should be released at the same time that Aquaman was coming out for maximum impact. And so another thing that we now need to think about, now that we have it confirmed that she didn't donate all this money that she said she would to ACLU, $3.5 million, this is actually a big deal because it means she lied when she was under oath in UK. And you can face perjury charges for that. So this is definitely very significant. The only other thing that really stood out to me from this past week's testimonies was Johnny's bodyguard, Starling Jenkins, came on and he testified that the evening after, or like the whole day that the shit incident occurred, Amber told him that she left a surprise for Johnny in his bed, obviously referencing the shit. So now we have not just Johnny saying that Amber did this, we have the bodyguard's testimony confirming that Amber said that she did this. So obviously that's a pretty wild situation. So this is outside of this week's new trial information, but something else that I found really interesting was I visited this subreddit called JusticeforJohnnyDepp. I've actually been frequenting it since the trial started, and there's this really crazy thread that I highly suggest you check out. It's called, "Was Amber Heard Involved in Vehicular Manslaughter as a Teen?" And it has a lot of seemingly strong evidence for that fact. So definitely check it out if you want to go down another rabbit hole. So now let's get to the main point of this video. Really what I want to recap is day 9 of the trial, Tuesday, 4/26, when Dr. Curry was on the stand. So before we get into this, I just want to give you a background about my own experience, and then sort of a little more information about, forensic psychologists, forensic psychiatrists, to sort of give you a base understanding of all this. So I have a lot of my own forensic experience as a psychiatrist. Beginning with when I was in residency, I rotated through a state hospital. It was a maximum security facility, and I would have to write legal documents on patients, like whether they should stay committed or whether they could get released. And these were for use in court cases. And then since residency, I have my own private practice, but I also still work on an inpatient unit in a state that has a really, really almost ridiculous process to get patients committed. That involves me having to write pretty lengthy legal papers, doing some interviews, and then finally going to court, with the patient, their public defender, different legal people, a judge, and I have to then explain why the patient either, is a danger to others, a danger to self, or can't care for themselves. Usually I'm arguing that they can't care for themselves. And then based upon that, the patient gets committed or doesn't get committed. Now, I didn't do a forensic fellowship. That is a subspecialty that some people in psychiatry opt to do if they want to primarily do forensic work, but I did not want to primarily do forensic work, and you don't necessarily need that fellowship. You could still do it without it. So that's my forensic background. And before I go further, I also want to make it clear that, psychiatrists or people in the mental health field, we can often disagree with each other. And the reason for this is, unlike in medicine, there's not like a lab or imaging that very clearly tells you what's wrong with someone. We don't have anything so overt. So it's all about your interpretation of someone's presentation. So take two psychiatrists, and very often they're going to, disagree with each other on some things, although maybe get some general bigger things agree with each other on. Like, for example, patients that we commit, I would say most psychiatrists are going to agree on the patients that need commitment because it's such a clear-cut thing. And I will say, as far as Johnny versus Amber, I have spoken to trusted psychiatric colleagues, and we see eye to eye on this case. So we have every single psychiatrist I've discussed this with, which of course I've only discussed it with my friends who, we're friends because we tend to agree with each other on things. They see eye to eye on this case. So now moving on, what is the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist? So I'm a psychiatrist. That means I went to college, then I went to med school, then I did a 4-year residency in psychiatry. So that includes some medicine stuff earlier on, and then tons of different settings. So inpatient units, outpatient stuff, state hospitals, children's hospitals, you name it, there's so many requirements that you really see so many different settings in residency. And, you do medication management, or you do therapy, you do all these different things. Versus a psychologist, goes to college, and then they do psychology graduate program. So Dr. Curry is a PsyD, but lots of psychologists are also PhDs. PhDs, usually you go that route if you want to focus on research, whereas like if you do a PsyD, you want to do more clinical work. So, working directly with patients versus doing research. And Dr. Curry's a PsyD, and I believe she also has some type of specialization in forensic psychology. So why do legal teams pick a psychologist to assess, the person that I guess they want to prove has some sort of mental health issue? I would say it's because psychologists usually use neuropsych testing for their diagnoses, whereas a psychiatrist does not do neuropsych testing. They are coming up with their diagnosis based on history and presentation, and then, maybe DSM criteria and stuff like that. Whereas like the psychologist is going to administer testing, and I think the court system sees that as more objective. So now let's move on to Dr. Curry's testimony. So here's what we need to know. Dr. Curry was asked by Johnny's legal team to, review everything they had, including mental health records, and then to assess Amber and then give, a diagnosis if Dr. Curry believes she had one. So Dr. Curry reported that she evaluated Amber for 2 days and essentially 12 hours total. And the results of her evaluation, she said, supported diagnoses of borderline personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder and found no signs of PTSD. So I thought, the first thing that stood out to me is no PTSD. Yay, because I did not think Amber had PTSD. Obviously, I'd already made it aware. I'm on Johnny's side from what I knew of the evidence up through last week, and I do believe that Amber is falsifying her claims. So she specifically for the PTSD, she said she used a test called CAPS-5. And based upon this test, there was evidence that Amber was grossly exaggerating her PTSD symptoms. She actually said Amber scored in the 98th percentile for exaggerating symptoms of PTSD. Now, as far as to get the other diagnoses, she said she used a test called the MMPI-2, also known as Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2. So what Dr. Curry said was that essentially this test can't be gamed and it looks for contraindications, but I don't fully agree. I think a smart person can always game a test a bit. Like, you're probably not, if you're like Amber and you're smart, which she is, you're probably not going to want to respond in a way to the test that's going to make you seem like an overt sociopath. So you're going to try to avoid that. And let's talk about what the MMPI-2 is. So it's 567 statements in which test takers reply to the statement if it's true or false. And you can actually look it up online. You can see a whole list of the 567 statements if you're curious. You could probably take it and get a score if you wanted to. I didn't look that much into it though. So I felt that, someone taking an MMPI-2 is similar to a lie detector test. They can certainly tell you some things, but they're not the end all be all. There are some people who are lying and are going to come up as not lying on a lie detector test because they know how to fool it, right? They're just so good at controlling their body's physiological response when they're anxious. So same with this, I think that it has a lot of utility and it can be fairly accurate, but not perfectly accurate, okay? Because people are always going to try to make themselves seem better than they are. Or some people might be just totally honest, but no one's going to try to, for example, make themselves seem worse than they are. So moving on, what Dr. Curry said initially about her results was that it seemed like she was trying to minimize any mental issues and appear completely free of pathology. And then either on the MMPI-2 or CAPS-5, when she was asked questions that were specific to trauma, that's when she seemed to have extreme exaggerations in her results. And a really important thing Dr. Curry pointed out is that Amber has been getting mental health treatment since long before she met Johnny, and she's had no decline in her psychological functioning. So something's really important, especially if someone's trying to claim PTSD, because if you had PTSD develop as the result of a relationship, you would have a decline in your psychological functioning. I mean, that's the definition of a disorder. Not everyone gets PTSD, by the way, even if they have trauma. There are plenty of people who have really good coping skills and they're, it's just not going to impact them the same way. But if you have a disorder, that inherently suggests that you have a decline in your functioning. So now I want to play 2 excerpts from Dr. Curry's testimony so that we can listen to them and sort of hear what she said the results of Amber's MMPI-2 meant. Okay, so I'm going to play the first clip.
One of the primary things I learned was that she had a very sophisticated way of minimizing any personal problems. I also learned that she tends to, there were a number of characteristics that were consistent with the eventual diagnoses, but some of the primary characteristics, and I'm going to try to condense 25 pages here, were essentially externalization of blame, tending to have a lot of inner hostility that is attempted to be controlled, a tendency to be very self-righteous, but to also deny that self-righteousness and to judge others critically against these sort of high standards for moral value, but also to deny doing that, essentially to claim that one is very non-judgmental and accepting and yet very full of rage, really. And these aren't facts, but her scores essentially correlated, so they were consistent with other people who obtained these scores who have been shown through many, many, many studies to have these very specific traits. So externalization of blame, a lot of inner anger and hostility, sometimes that anger among these groups with similar scores, these people might have that anger kind of explode out at times. They tend to be very passive aggressive. They may be self-indulgent, very self-centered. They could use manipulation tactics to try to get their needs met, very needy of attention, acceptance, approval. They tend to distance people who are close to them. Initially, they may seem very charming. They're very socially sophisticated, actually. That was a major component on there. They have a capacity to kind of offer some of their faults, but in a way, but only the ones that people think of lightly and can all relate to. And so they can present as very fair and balanced, but in actuality, they really might be very judgmental of others and unaware of problems in their behavior and their thinking.
So after you...
Okay, so what did she just describe? That's not what I understand to be BPD or HPD. That's what I understand to be MPD. She described spot on what I would expect from someone with narcissistic personality disorder. Now, I'm not going to get back into explaining narcissistic personality disorder. You know, you can either Google narcissism, like DSM-5 criteria, or you can go back to my other video where I went over it. But that is all spot on narcissism. She's not describing borderline traits, histrionic traits. That is narcissistic traits. Nothing there described what I would expect from someone with borderline or histrionic, traits or personality disorder. So it's I was like listening to this and I'm like, how can you say that that's her results, but you don't say that she's narcissistic in your assessment of her? And then she actually goes on and she gives further information about Amber's results, which I will play now.
So a 3-6 code type, a lot of that anger is expressed in this code type. There can be actually a lot of cruelty, usually with people who are less powerful. Actually, when you see this code type, you want to, if you can, to follow up with subordinates, co-workers, people who may have observed their behavior more closely. The 3-6 code type is very concerned with their image, very attention-seeking, very prone to externalizing blame to a point where it's unclear whether they can even admit to themselves that they do have responsibility in certain areas. A lot of suppressed and denied anger, but the anger is very present, will explode out, and a lot of issues in their close relationships.
Okay, so once again, she's describing narcissistic personality disorder with perhaps antisocial traits. This is not something I would expect from someone with just borderline, just BPD. This is narcissism, potentially antisocial traits. And just to make it clear, Amber certainly can have histrionic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, and also have narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. You can really have them all. So I'm definitely not saying that Amber doesn't have the histrionic personality disorder or the borderline personality disorder. I'm just saying all the evidence that was given from her MMPI-2 is very consistent with narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial traits. And I want to make it clear, shitting on someone's bed is antisocial behavior. That's not even narcissism. That's not even borderline. That's not even histrionic. That is straight up antisocial. That is what a sociopath does. Like, that's it. So now I'm going to go into when Dr. Curry breaks down borderline personality disorder. And before I get to this, I want to say, I am so passionate about borderline personality disorder, which is why I think it was a bit hard for me to watch this part of the testimony, aka Dr. Curry's testimony. I have tons and tons of borderline patients in my private practice throughout, I've diagnosed tons of people in the inpatient setting. And, generally, they're very sweet people who are suffering significantly, and they tend to internalize, not externalize. So they're not going to hurt someone else. They're going to hurt themselves. They're going to be people who maybe self-harm or have suicide attempts. They're not the type of person who goes and does something to someone else. So I'm going to get more into that in a bit. But let's go back to Dr. Curry and how she described BPD. So she described it as a disorder of stability driven by underlying terror or abandonment. I'm not going to dismiss that, but that's not really the way I describe it to most people. I often say that, the certain components of it are highly genetic, and then other components of it are learned behaviors from childhood or teenage experiences that might have benefited you when you were younger, but now you're an adult and it is no longer helping you, it's harming your life. So moving on, what symptoms of BPD did she sort of say Amber had? Well, she brought up that Amber had a history of one incident where she cut herself. So sure, that, that certainly could be related to BPD, as that is one of the traits, self-harm. And then she moved on and she said, well, BPD includes extreme behaviors like physical aggression, which I've already sort of stated, maybe I don't agree with so much. Some other things that I agreed can certainly be true. She states that BPD individuals have behavior that is exhausting for their partners. Sure. She said the partner may try to make them happy by allowing themselves to be a punching bag, thinking that they can solve the problem, but then it overwhelms them. Sure. Then getting back to the physical aggression, she said that women with borderline personality disorder may incite physical violence against their partner during a fight, or more likely threaten to involve the legal system by filing a restraining order or claiming abuse. Now, obviously, we know this is what Johnny is saying Amber did in his whole defense, so it makes sense that this would be brought up. But I firmly believe that people who file a restraining order for no reason except to get back at their partner or claim abuse when it didn't happen, that is not a borderline trait. That is not something that is consistent with borderline personality disorder. That is absolutely narcissistic, if not something a sociopath would do. Someone who's borderline would not, that's just not part of it. If they're just borderline is what I'm saying, because certainly there could be someone who is BPD and also has narcissism or traits of antisocial or something like that. Another thing that she brought up, I guess, as part of like the BPD was she mentioned that she read the testimony of a former friend of Amber named Raquel Pennington. And this Raquel said that Amber once struck her in the face out of nowhere. Like, quite clearly that's abuse. Would I use that to, argue that someone had BPD? No, I would use it to argue narcissism, antisocial, not borderline. And then Dr. Curry went on to say that physical abuse is typical of borderlines. Like, what? No. So I fact-checked her, and I found a large 2016 study in the UK that found that individuals with borderline personality alone did not have a tendency for violence, only if they had comorbidities such as antisocial personality disorder and substance abuse, which do raise the risk of violence. And we know that Amber has substance abuse, and we can't say with certainty that she doesn't have antisocial personality disorder unless we're assuming that Dr. Curry ruled that out and her word is the end all be all. So, and just to reiterate that, so this systemic search of studies confirmed that there's a lack of evidence that BPD alone increases violent behavior. Then Dr. Curry started going on and on about splitting. So if you don't know what splitting is, I'm going to go through it now. Splitting is when you go from idealizing someone to devaluing them. So, I love you, you're the best person in the world, versus I hate you, you're the worst person in the world, I want to kill you, I wish you would die. So very, very, very drastic, right? So she says this is the hallmark of borderline personality disorder. At this point, I'm like feeling rage inside of me, because no, that is not the hallmark of borderline personality disorder at all. It's what uninformed people think the hallmark of borderline personality disorder is, okay? It's when you're in med school or residency and there's someone who thinks they know more than they know and they say, oh, that person's splitting the team, the medical team that's taking care of them. So they have BPD. And yes, it is a criteria of BPD, but, we don't diagnose things based on one criteria. And let me tell you what the actual hallmark criteria of BPD is, because it's not splitting. So there are studies that have looked at this. So the criteria that is actually the most sensitive for BPD is affective instability, aka emotional lability, aka frequent mood swings, okay? Not splitting. And it's also thought to be very highly genetic. Like, even if you don't have a trauma component, like, you can develop that, and it's not something medications are really going to help with. Therapy can help, somewhat, but that one is so highly genetic, it's like the hardest thing to treat. So moving on, another thing she said that was evidence that Amber has BPD was that her medications that she took for anxiety and depression didn't help. And she said this was typical of BPD. And I'm not going to argue that, because it is typical of BPD. But guess what it could also be typical of? Narcissism, for sure. Narcissists do sometimes seek out mental health care, right? Because they're depressed, because their significant other is upset with them all the time. And the reason they're upset is, well, because of that, but really because they have behaviors that make their partner upset with them all the time, right? So a medication isn't going to fix that. And the other evidence she gave was that Amber responded well to a stimulant, which she said there's evidence that people with BPD won't respond well to any other meds, but they'll like a stimulant. Okay, well, you could take like any population of people and they're probably going to like a stimulant, because what is a stimulant? It's legal methamphetamine. It's legal amphetamine. It is legal drugs that make you feel better. And I'm not saying that they don't have their purpose, because absolutely they do have a purpose with people with ADHD. But just because someone likes them doesn't mean they have ADHD. It doesn't mean they have BPD. It doesn't mean they have anything. They just make people feel better. So of course someone's going to like them. So I was really just wondering, why did Amber only get the diagnoses of histrionic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder? So I found an example of a past case that is much worse. And let me tell you about it. So this took place maybe over 15 years ago. I don't really know, but I remember it, but I was quite young. Someone named Jodi Arias, and she is famous for murdering her husband. She is in prison, life in prison now. So in her trial, the psychologist, once again, on the side of the prosecution, only mentioned that, when he did tests with her, she came up having results that indicated she had BPD. And then he ruled out that she had PTSD, which was her defense. So very, very similar to this, although obviously a much more egregious case, right? So if we are going to say that someone murdered their husband, and we're not going to say that they have, narcissism or antisocial, then who are we going to say has that? Because murdering your husband is the most fucking antisocial thing you can do. There is nothing more antisocial than murdering someone. If we don't think that murdering someone for no reason is indicative of antisocial personality disorder, then the personality disorders shouldn't even exist. Because if that isn't a sociopath, then who is? So now, what I want to share is excerpts from a book I read when I was an intern in residency. So my first year, I read a book called Stop Walking on Eggshells, and it's about, interacting with borderlines in your life. And it was so enlightening for me because I had been in, relationships with people with some type of BPD and like other people in my life, and it really, really helped me. So what this book did, that is sort of what I've been hinting at or talking about this whole time, is that there can be people with just borderline personality disorder, and how do those people present? Like no other personality disorders, just BPD. And then people who have borderline personality disorder potentially have some other type of personality disorder as well. Okay, and this book categorizes them as, mostly BPD, and these are the mostly lower functioning conventional borderlines, what we think of when we think of someone with borderline personality disorder. And then the other category is higher functioning people with borderline personality disorder who are invisible because people don't recognize that they have it. So I'm going to start with the lower functioning conventional borderlines. So this book states that their coping techniques are acting in, so mostly self-destructive acts such as self-harm, which is something I already talked about earlier. And what is their willingness to obtain help? Well, they have self-harm and suicidal tendencies, so it often brings them into the mental health system, both as inpatients and outpatients, and they have a very high interest in therapy. What about their co-occurring mental health issues? So in these conditions, it's often things like eating disorders or other very serious things that require medical intervention and contribute to their low functioning. And then how is their functioning? Well, borderline and their associated conditions make it difficult for them to live independently, to hold a job, to manage finances, and their families often have to step in to help. And then what is the impact on their family members? There is a major family focus on practical issues such as finding treatment, preventing, reducing the borderline self-destructive behavior, and providing practical and emotional support. The parents often feel extreme guilt and are emotionally overwhelmed. So now let's look at the criteria for mostly higher functioning, invisible borderlines. What are their coping techniques? Acting out. So uncontrolled and impulsive rages, criticism, and blame. Okay. What about their willingness to obtain help? They have a state of denial, much like an untreated alcoholic, which also has been brought up in the evidence about Amber. Disavows responsibility for relationship difficulties, refuses treatment when confronted, accuses others of having BPD, may see a therapist if threatened, but rarely takes it seriously or stays long. So I want to do a little subnote here because we know that Amber was in mental health treatment for a long time. But people who are in this category and have narcissism or even antisocial or other things, they are not against mental health care treatment if they can find someone who will just side with them. So the reason they usually run into difficulties in therapy, because if the therapist is doing it right, they will challenge them, okay? But if the therapist is just like a yes man and agrees with this individual and says, everything is everybody else's fault and you're the one who's right, then that individual is going to really like it and they're probably going to keep going back because they're getting the validation they need. What about someone in this category's co-occurring mental health issues? Concurrent illness, most commonly a substance use disorder, check. Or another personality disorder, especially narcissistic personality disorder. Okay. Moving on. What is their functioning? appears normal, even charismatic to outsiders, but exhibits borderline traits behind closed doors. May have a career and be successful. Check. Impact on family members. Without an obvious illness, family members blame themselves for relationship problems and try to get their emotional needs met. They make fruitless efforts to persuade their borderline to get professional help. Major issues include high conflict divorces and custody cases. Okay. All right. So maybe you see why I think the way I do now. So moving on. Okay, so another thing Dr. Curry did, she, of course, diagnosed Amber with histrionic personality disorder as well. And when she described histrionic personality disorder, she said the underlying drive is always to be the center of attention, otherwise will feel empty. She said they like to make up stories, take on the victim role. They're into their looks because they want positive attention. They're subtly flirtatious with everyone, even therapists, because they want to be liked. They give them gifts. But once again, I don't believe this diagnosis tells us anything. Like a narcissist is all of these things and more. And like I explained in my last video, I've never diagnosed a single patient with histrionic personality disorder. I've never seen someone else diagnose it. It doesn't really tell us much clinically. Because the reality is that, histrionic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder are all one type of personality disorders, right? They're cluster B. There's cluster A, which is like mildly psychotic personality disorders, and then cluster C, that's sort of like sad people who interact poorly with the world, for lack of a simpler way to explain it. And then there's cluster B, which is these. So in terms of seriousness, I see it this way. Histrionic personality disorder, because they can be like happy, they can just be like, people that like attention, but they recognize that they have insight into it. Their friends think it's funny, like very dramatic. We all have friends with histrionic personality disorder. People who are like into acting or things like that. It doesn't mean that like they're a terrible person or anything. And then above that is borderline personality disorder, because usually people with borderline personality disorder are always going to suffer as a result of it, right? Then narcissism, they're not suffering, but everyone around them is suffering. And then antisocial, causing crazy amounts of suffering to those. So that's sort of how I see it. So sure, someone could have all of them. So this is going to come up later, but in Amber's lawyer's defense, labeling someone histrionic and narcissistic and they're a woman is pretty spot on for the sort of sexist tradition of how these present, and not labeling the woman as narcissistic or antisocial. And men tend to get labeled that, and then the women get labeled the histrionic and the borderline. So, the rest of Dr. Curry's testimony was really, she was cross-examined by Amber's lawyer. So I wanted to make some comments on that. So Amber's lawyer accused Dr. Curry of sexism, and she brought up that borderline is more likely to be diagnosed in a woman, which is true. I think that Amber's lawyer brought up like 80% of people with BPD diagnoses are women. So, is labeling someone with this sexist? I mean, potentially, but here's the flip side of that coin. Narcissism and antisocial are underdiagnosed in women. So I don't know if you want to pull that card, at least if you're talking to me. And then the lawyer brought up, like, I guess as a excuse for Amber is that borderline personality disorder is caused by trauma. I guess maybe she was insinuating that it developed because of trauma from Johnny, but borderline personality disorder doesn't develop randomly in adulthood. It's there from the beginning of your adulthood. So that wouldn't really work either. Anyways, Dr. Curry was like, well, it could be caused by trauma or genetics, and technically someone could just have genetics and not any trauma, which I don't fully disagree with, but I feel like it's always some combination of the both, and just the more genetics you have for it, the less trauma you need. So another thing that Amber's lawyer brought up, they were trying to make it look like that Johnny Depp's team had decided that Amber had borderline personality disorder and told Dr. Curry to diagnose her with it, which maybe they did. I can't comment on that. All I know is that if they had talked to me, I would have suggested some heavier personality disorders go in there based upon the evidence. And Amber's lawyer brought up that Johnny had even mentioned to Amber that she was borderline, I think on one of the audio recordings, and it was long before this. So, here's the thing. Lots of people are aware of borderline, and it's somewhat acceptable to be a supportive partner to someone with borderline based upon all the things I've said about borderline, right? That they're suffering people, that they need help. But people are a lot less familiar with, narcissism, or until sort of recently, it's been getting a lot of attention, or antisocial personality disorder. But the reality is, if you actually believe your partner is narcissistic or antisocial, you're not even going to be in the relationship to argue with them. You're going to already be out the door if you truly recognize that. So if you're in a relationship with someone and you're arguing with them, you're likely of anything going to accuse them of being borderline, just because that's something that they're, that person generally isn't that abusive. They're just suffering. Okay. So then another thing the lawyer brought up that was very dumb was she was accusing Dr. Curry of not being an intimate partner violence expert. And Dr. Curry was like, there's no such thing as that. And then the lawyer was bringing up, she stated that if you accuse someone of cheating, you're a perpetrator of intimate partner violence. But you could accuse someone of cheating and they could have actually cheated on you. So how does that make you a perpetrator of intimate partner violence? It didn't make any sense. Another thing I liked was that Dr. Curry pointed out that it was inappropriate for Amber's therapist to make statements about Johnny's mental health, because the lawyer brought up that, Amber's therapist said that he felt that Amber was unsafe around Johnny. And Dr. Curry essentially said this one is unethical, and I agree, because Amber's lawyer brought up statements from both Amber's therapist and her psychiatrist saying Johnny had all these issues, but they've never examined him and he's not their patient. And clearly, they're being manipulated by Amber. Come on. So then another thing that Dr. Curry noted was, and this goes back to when I explained how a narcissist could enjoy therapy. Dr. Curry said a therapist, to have a successful relationship with their patient, they have to take them at their word. Whereas her role as an examiner, she doesn't have to do that. So of course, Amber's therapist and psychiatrist have to align with her. That's the only way they're going to be able to maintain that therapeutic relationship. So, there's so much more I could go into, but that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Hopefully it helped and you enjoyed it. If you do like this video, subscribe, comment, turn on notifications. Also, in the description down below, I will link to my Instagram, Armchair Psychiatrist, if you want more of my thoughts. And if you want to learn more